Good morning. I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started. This morning I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Robin Kimmerer. Dr. Kimmerer is a mother, plant ecologist, writer, and professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. Kimmerer's research interests include the ecology of mosses and the role of traditional ecological knowledge in ecological restoration. In collaboration with tribal partners, she and her students have an active research program in the ecology and restoration of plants of cultural significance to Native people. She has developed university courses in aspects of botany, ecology, ethnobotany, and Native American natural resource management, as well as a seminar in the application of traditional ecological knowledge to conservation. She is active in efforts to broaden access to environmental science training for Native students and to introduce the benefits of traditional ecological knowledge to the scientific community in a way that respects and protects Indigenous knowledge. Robin is the chair and co-founder of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge section of the Ecological Society of America. She's involved with environmental education programs with community members on the Onondaga Nation School. Robin is an enrolled member of the Citizen Band of Potawatomi. Her interests in restoration include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationships to land. She has published articles both on the science of plant ecology and on the contributions of traditional ecological knowledge to our understanding of the natural world. She is also active in literary biology and has served as a writer in residence at the Andrews Experimental Forest and the Mesa Refuge. Her book, Gathering Moss, draws on both scientific and indigenous ways of knowing and was awarded the 2005 John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. She is currently working on a second book, exploring reciprocity of relationships with the land. Robin?
Could you hit the lights, Connie? And thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you again for coming and for ACES for putting this conference together. I know I sure am learning a lot. I was asked to talk a bit about ecological restoration and the multiple dimensions that we try to work on it with, my grad students and I. And I also want to tell you that at least the beginning of this talk comes from the fact that I so rarely get to talk about this work in front of an audience of largely Native people. I feel like an awful lot of the work that I do is trying to convince my colleagues in Western science that there is a place for this kind of knowledge. And you may, some of these things, some of the first slides, you may just nod your head and say, well, yes, of course we know that. But oftentimes the audience that I'm talking to are not having that response. So. I want to start off with sort of this romantic idea from E.O. Wilson about restoration, who says, there can be no purpose more inspiring than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us. And I agree that this is a wonderful challenge that we have before us, but you have to temper that with a little bit of reality. Tony Bradshaw, who's one of the arguably the fathers of thinking about ecological restoration, really chastised Western scientists who were so interested in decomposing ecosystems and trying to figure out how they work. He said that the acid test of our understanding is not whether we can take ecosystems to bits on pieces of paper, but whether we can put them together again and practice and make them work. And that is certainly part of our challenge. This is also, of course, part of the political arena. If we look at former Secretary of the Interior Babbitt, who, when confronted with some of the issues concerning forest health in the West, made what I think is a remarkable political statement, which the current Secretary of the Interior probably would not say. But in an effort to restore forest health and diversity, federal agencies under his direction were calling for a return to the pre-settlement equilibrium. And to my mind, that's a pretty exciting thing until you start thinking, well, what do they mean by the pre-settlement equilibrium? First of all, were our ecosystems ever in a static condition and equilibrial? And what do they mean by pre-settlement? More often than not, the ecologists that I tend to encounter think about pre-settlement as sort of this primeval forest. They have fully embraced the myth of the pristine, that all of the forest communities that we have here in North America were somehow untouched by human hands. There are a quote here that I love, this idea of thinking about virgin land, but a very early writer, Francis Jennings, in the 1700s said, the land of North America was less virgin than widowed, because he understood the role of Native people in tending the resources and shaping the land. And so really what happened, of course, at the time of dispossession of land was that the land was widowed. The people who were taking care of it could no longer exercise their traditional caregiving practices. And this is, I think, intimately tied to restoration. So here's another couple of academic authorities, anyway, to talk about this idea that if we want to return forests to pre-settlement equilibrium, what does that mean? These natural areas. If Aboriginal predation and burning created plant and animal communities, then the only way to maintain what we call natural areas is to duplicate Aboriginal processes and influences. I don't know if this is what Secretary Babbitt had in mind, but I like it. If we translate that through our lens. So anyway, if we have this goal to recreate forests of pre-settlement structure, I think it's inevitable then that forest managers have to think about traditional ecological knowledge, innovation, and practice. Thank you. I'm going to add TEKIP to my thinking. I had shared this list with you from the IUCN program on traditional knowledge yesterday morning. And so these are a list of ways that a lot of scientists view the value of traditional knowledge. But I think what we have to add to this list now is that traditional knowledge can be useful as we think about strategies and goals for ecological restoration. One of the things I would like to do this morning is to get some more ideas from you of how to increase this list, both for our own communities and for the point of talking to mainstream natural resource managers to convince them about the ways that traditional knowledge can be useful in these strategies for ecological restoration. Here's at least a beginning list of some of the things some of the ways that I think that traditional knowledge can be important as we enter this age of restoration. First on the list is a source of knowledge about reference ecosystems. If you've been to the Society for Ecological Restoration meetings, as I know many of you have, or hang out with restoration ecologists much, one of the things that consumes a great deal of airtime, or another way of saying a great deal of hot air, I suppose, is this question of what should the reference ecosystem be? As we strive to restore an ecosystem, to what? To this pre-settlement equilibrium? What does that mean? To the condition immediately before disturbance? To the condition at the close of the little ice age? What? What are we trying to restore to? And I think this is a situation in which traditional ecological knowledge can be very informative about what should, we'll get to these questions of should and is that Ron was sharing with us yesterday. What should the reference ecosystem be, and how can traditional knowledge help us identify what that restoration goal might be? Oftentimes, we don't know what the pre-settlement condition was. So if the federal government has said this is our goal, a pre-settlement equilibrium, what might that have been, incorporating the actions of Native people? So where could we get information on what should the species composition of our restored ecosystem be? Certainly in indigenous languages. There are a number of situations. The one I'm familiar with is some work that Dennis Martinez and Frank Lake have done in Northern California, where they were restoring degraded cut-over redwood land. And they said, well, what should be the understory in this land that we're trying to restore? Nobody really knew, because those lands had been damaged for so long. So they went to the indigenous languages. They went to the remaining speakers in these Northern California groups, said, tell us the names of all of the plants that you remember for medicine, for food, for baskets, etc. And within the languages, there were many, it basically created a species list for what might be part of this reference ecosystem. Certainly oral histories, as we're well aware, are good ways to get ideas of what the community may have been. But again, increasingly a lot of our scientific colleagues don't access oral history or ethnographies. It's just not part of our scientific training. The harvesting and management practices that our people have used on the land are also critical to understanding what that reference ecosystem would be, because the reference ecosystem is a whole lot more than a species list, as we know. It's a list of practices. It's disturbance regimes that were part of those ecosystem processes. And people as agents of ecological change and ecological change, I suppose the best way to say it, in their communities need to be part of this reference ecosystem as well. The processes, not just the pieces. Material culture. This basket up here to remind me about that. Some of Kat Anderson, a wonderful ethnobotanist, her work, and others have been actually using baskets to try to reconstruct what the reference ecosystems had been in Northern California. For example, they were trying to argue that they needed to reintroduce a fire regime of a certain frequency. And Forest Service folks will say, well, no, there's no information to say that. Fire frequency was part of the pre-settlement equilibrium. And this ethnobotanical approach said, oh yeah, there is. Let's look at the baskets. Let's look at the cradle boards. Let's see that to make a cradle board, it takes, I don't know, I'm making up this number, 30 straight shoots of redbud. Okay, well, how do you get those 30 shoots? If you go out in the wetlands now, do you find them? No, they're all branchy, and you could never make anything out of them. They need to be burned. Well, if you need 30 straight, recently burned shoots to make one cradle board, and we estimate the population to have been whatever, therefore we know that we needed this many acres of burned redbud. And from this they were able to reconstruct what they thought the historic fire frequencies might have been. So material culture, particularly baskets, have been a real key to trying to infer what these reference ecosystems might have been. Certainly, our ceremonies contain an awful lot of information about the plants and animals that we used and their relative abundance in the ecosystem. And then, of course, remnant landscapes. For myself, I'd say for the Haudenosaunee Nation, people of the place of the fire, one of our remnant landscapes are the prairies of Walpole Island. And botanists from all over the world come to the tallgrass prairies of Walpole Island because they have a complete species complement, some of the highest species richness of any of the tallgrass prairie remnants. Well, why might that be? Well, the 3 council fires of Walpole Island burn it every single year. It's an uninterrupted history of burning on that remnant landscape. So this too is a source of knowledge about what should these reference ecosystems be. And so I think this may just be a beginning list, and I would like to engage in a bit with what you think might be some other things that we could add to this list. I've kind of alluded to this next point on the list. Another way that TEK can be useful in thinking about ecological restoration is in land management practices. These ideas of the disturbance regimes that human beings have placed on the landscape and the response of ecological communities to them, probably the most notable of which is fire. And this is getting a lot of press, as you probably all know. Has anybody dipped into the new book, 1491? A lot of you, yeah. I mean, these ideas in the mainstream of anthropogenic landscapes is really upsetting a lot of the status quo of thinking about the role of people in landscapes. But anyway, so some of these traditional land practices are certainly fire, but pruning and coppicing of shrubs, particularly wetland shrubs, range extension. There's quite a good literature out there. And of course, as people moved between their grounds and as people migrated, they took their plants with them. And so these reference ecosystems, the things that people think are natural snapshots of the distribution of plants, may in fact have been influenced by people who moved those plants around with them. Certainly watershed management, some of the classic examples from Polynesian islanders who managed their family lands as watershed units. The fact that fires create ecotones and patches, really creating this landscape mosaic that gave our people food security by having lots of different successional patches in different ages that were producing different kinds of food. These are alternative successional models for thinking about what a restored landscape might look like. Just a reminder about the importance of fire here. And we tend to think, at least out here in the West, I'm mindful of being in the West, coming from an Eastern perspective, we often think about fire as being important here. But even in where I come from, which is sometimes called the asbestos forest, burning was an important part of land clearing. And the land has changed dramatically with the cessation of that burning. And so when we restore ecosystems where I live, should they include fire or not? One of the interesting things, I think, to think about the way that people used fire is absolutely consistent, again, trying to find this common ground between TEK and Western science. One of the big ideas recently in Western science has been this intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that folks have discovered that an intermediate level of disturbance maximizes biodiversity, maximizes landscape heterogeneity. Well, this was not discovered in 1989 when the first intermediate disturbance hypothesis papers came out. This is how our people manage the land, maximizing diversity by creating intermediate disturbances. And that too can give us a model for thinking about how to restore ecosystems. Now to the bottom of this list, Connie mentioned that one of the things that interests me greatly is not only the science of ecological restoration, but the restoration of relationship to land. And when you talk to restoration ecologists, they often use this term authenticity. What is it that makes a landscape authentic? We could replant a tall grass prairie, but is it real? Is it a real tall grass prairie without people, without people's disturbance regimes, without a history? So this idea of authenticity, I think traditional knowledge can also inform. And then lastly, but I think very importantly, this idea of traditional knowledge being associated with restoration of cultural relationships. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of a case study trying to bridge TEK and SEK with some of my students at home. This idea of standing in one place and understanding the importance of traditional knowledge, but then somehow translating this into university and agency science. Science we all know this, it's very hard to do. So I'm just going to share with you some of the things that we've been thinking about and hopefully learn from the rest of you what you've been doing too. So interestingly, where I live back in upstate New York, we have I think a very happy juxtaposition of my university, SUNY ESF, arguably a center for scientific ecological knowledge. We train the bulk of natural resource managers in the East and in the Northeast. But just 6 miles down the road, we have a center of traditional ecological knowledge, the Onondaga Nation. And there had been historically no relationship between the university and the nation. Again, our reserves in the East are so different from the big pieces of land that many of you enjoy here. The Onondaga Nation is 4,300 acres. It's just a little piece of land. The environmental impacts have been great from that much edge effect, if you will, constantly being under siege. And so here is a situation where restoration on a very fine scale is one of the strategies that's called for. And I want to just digress knowingly for a minute. Usually I digress unknowingly, but knowingly to say a bit about the Onondaga Nation right now, where it is the oldest continuous democracy on the planet. They have never accepted federal governments. They have a traditional government, and they have never surrendered that. There's no BIA presence at Onondaga Nation. But they have, of course, been reduced from a quarter of New York State and the Great Lakes to their 4,300 acres. And they have recently filed, like many of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy tribes, a land claim. Only they don't call it a land claim. It's a land rights action. And what they're trying to do is to use their traditional knowledge, the great law of peace brought to them by the peacemaker, as a political and legal tool for ecological restoration. Many of the tribes near us are working on their land claims for monetary compensation, of course, in order to try to get land back, for casino deals. We know the whole gamut of ways that this works. But what the Onondaga Nation has said is we're not going to displace our neighbors. And money isn't really what we need. What we need is title to that land so that we can be, once again, the caregiving agents for that land. And what they're doing is asking for restoration of the land, not for claim to the land, but for restoration, to clean up the lakes and to restore the mine lands and all the other insults within their Aboriginal territories. So if the nation is interested in, the Onondaga Nation is interested in restoration, as many of us are, what does that mean? Well, one of the definitions, of course, probably the working definition that most of my scientific colleagues embrace, is the one from the National Research Council. Let's just have a look at some of the important things in there. The return of an ecosystem to a close approximation of its condition prior to disturbance is how they define restoration. And then they go farther, which is a good thing. In restoration, ecological damage to the resource is repaired, but both the structure and the function of the ecosystem are recreated. Merely creating the form without the function, or the function in an artificial configuration bearing little resemblance to the natural resource, doesn't constitute restoration. And while this may seem a fairly safe and standard definition of restoration, it actually is pretty landmark, comparing the early, for example, mine land restoration laws, where restoration meant you got alfalfa to grow on mine land for 7 years before you turned off the irrigation. That was restoration. So the National Research Council's definition about structure and function having to be restored is important, but I think doesn't go far enough. Here we see a lengthy statement from the Indigenous Environmental Network, their statement about ecological restoration. And I think, and I've highlighted here what I think is perhaps most relevant to our discussion, that ecological restoration is inseparable from cultural and spiritual restoration, and is inseparable from our spiritual responsibilities of caregiving and world renewal. These are the kinds of ideas that don't appear in the NRC definition of restoration, of people as a part and a continuing part of this process. So essentially what we have here are two different views of ecological restoration. The Cairns definition is more aligned with the National Research Council. What are we trying to do? Restore ecosystem structure and function for delivery of, quote, ecosystem services. That's the definition of it. How do you do that? It's usually an engineered solution. It's an imposed solution. People decide what they want that piece of land to look like, what's the ecosystem, what's the reference ecosystem, and then you engineer it to make it happen and make it stay that way, because we have decided that's what the piece of land ought to be. The time frame, decades. Again, way better than in the old mine land reclamation days when it was only 7 years. But on the opposite side, we have a listing of attributes from the IPRN, which is the Indigenous Peoples Restoration Network, a group under the umbrella of the Society for Ecological Restoration, largely under the leadership of Dennis Martinez, who I understand was here January? Yeah, okay. So in the IPRN statements, notice what is the first thing on the list. of restoration. The first thing is restoration of relationship to land as one of the first priorities. And that we restore respect and reciprocity with that landscape. And then instead of being an imposed solution, a lot of the IPRN thinking really involves engagement of natural processes. Rather than trying to bypass them with a bulldozer, engage them. And in the process of natural, sort of natural processes, an example that comes to mind is oftentimes there will be early successional plants that will come into a restoration that you might want to, in the John Carnes mode, rip them out of there because they're going to slow your attainment of this equilibrial reference ecosystem. But there's this other idea, this is the plants have their own wisdom. They come to this place for a good reason. They're often nitrogen fixers that need to be there to build up the soil so that the later successional plants can come in. So those natural processes, rather than an engineered solution, are part of the IPRN model. And then the time frame, not surprisingly, is much longer, generations. Dennis Martinez had shared with me the phase 1 of the Karuk tribal restoration model. Phase 1 lasts 1 century. So they're definitely thinking about it on a different time scale. But I think one of the things that is really important to me when we think about ecological restoration is we look at the land and we say, well, that place is messed up. That's broken land. But land in general has its own resilience, its own healing ability over time. And how did they get broken in the first place? Those lands are broken because our relationship to the lands are broken. And so I think it's terribly important that we talk about healing relationship with land at the same time that we are planting seeds and renewing nutrient cycles. So just as restoration ecologists ask, what should the reference ecosystem be? What do we envision as the reference relationship? What is it that we might restore as a relationship to places? And again, I want to engage everybody's thinking in this. Some of our concepts of right relationship certainly are associated with kinship, the concentric ecology. I think Alan was talking about in Enrique Salmon's work. The ideas of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility to land are certainly part of this reference relationship. But what does that mean in practice? How do we restore relationship? I've gleaned some ideas about this. Education. Just know your neighbors. You know, in mainstream society, it was said that our grandparents, if you ask them how many plants did they know, and they just rattled off a list that would be over 100 plants that they knew very well. They could recognize them. Do you know what it is now? If you stopped people on the street, how many plants names do you know? And you know, actually, I'm not sure how those questions were framed in this study. How many plants do you know, or do you really know them? Could you recognize them? You know how many it is? 6. 6 plants, and they include things like Christmas tree and grass. So, yeah. So there's been this tremendous erosion of knowing your neighbors. And that is, to me, part of, it's not just that I'm a botanist, but it's erosion of relationship if we don't even know the names of our neighbors. Accountability to our places, monitoring the health of our places, knowing what plants and animals are there, what ecosystem processes are there, and intervening when appropriate. Real homeland security. Responsibility. Ecological compassion. This is another place, I think, where traditional knowledge has so much to offer, because our circles of ecological compassion, if you will, go to all, not just the human persons, but the non-human persons as well. And I think that's a part of restoring relationship. A physical connection of reciprocity, knowing where your food comes from, your material connection to place, getting your hands dirty, ceremony, lots of possible ways to do this. So as we're thinking about these different ways of knowing and the different contributions of SEK and TEK to this process, I I think that one of the strengths of scientific ecological knowledge is the tools and predictions that come for restoring structure and function, for the tools that allow us to understand nutrient cycling, watershed hydrology, et cetera. Important tools, very important. But traditional knowledge also can bring us to these kinds of knowledge of structure and function through processes of ways that people related to land and species composition, as I've alluded to. But I think it's traditional ecological knowledge alone that can be particularly helpful in looking at restoration of relationships. And not just in our native communities. I've been trying to think about this idea of becoming indigenous to place, that in a nation composed primarily of immigrants, how do you have a relation to your place? And I wonder whether it could be sort of captured in this idea of relating to your landscape as if you were born here, as if this was truly your own place. And as we've seen with looking at traditional knowledge all over the world, it comes from intimacy with place. And how can we once again reestablish that intimacy with place? But got to be careful, I think, about that when again, as from the botanical perspective, becoming indigenous, well, plants are pretty good at that. You know, here's a little common plantain. Do you have that out here? Yeah, okay. It's not a native plant, but I would argue that it has become indigenous. It's a plant which is really useful, which fits into our ecosystems. It doesn't take over. It's become part of our ecosystems. That plant has become naturalized to place, or become indigenous to place, as opposed to kudzu, which is you know, also one that has come to us more recently, but we could argue is not a particularly good citizen. Okay. So to take this to a place-based, to Onondaga Nation, which is where I do much of my work. Clan mother Audrey Shenandoah has been a great mentor. And when we first talked to our colleagues at the Nation about restoration on the Nation, which was so badly needed, we sat down to say, well, what are the priorities? What are the projects that we could, as a university tribal partnership, what are the things that we could tackle first? And I was thinking, well, we're going to clean up that medical waste dump, you know, we're going to go here, we're going to bring these plants back that have not been here. And Audrey said, nope, relationship first. She said the first thing that you have to do is educate, particularly educate the children. She was very concerned that these ideas of caregiving for the 4,300 acres were being eroded because the kids weren't even in the woods anymore. They were sitting home watching, you know, playing video games or something. So she asked that one of the first things that we do together was to try to put in place some joint education projects to maintain connection to the land. So I'm just going to go real quickly through some of these things that we have worked on. I guess as a sidebar, I just want to say about this that much of this work has been done with my grad students. And oftentimes our graduate programs are very focused on doing the science, getting the thesis done. Everybody's nodding their heads, yep, that's what it's about. But Wendell Berry, in his book, Life is a Miracle, has this wonderful passage where he says, what if, scientists, what if in the tenure process, your tenure portfolio was not only about your science and about your teaching, but about your support of the community that you come from? What if that was part of a tenure portfolio? And, well, we have to begin somewhere. So I encourage my grad students that has to be part of the work that they do, is working with the community. So much of this work is theirs. So with the Onondaga Nation School, we've done quite a lot of programs with them and in environmental science and so forth. My good friend Jeannie Shenandoah, who is a botanist and traditional herbalist at the Nation, she and I have been working together a lot on these questions of plant restoration. And again, this is driven by community goals, working with the Onondaga Nation School, which is at the heart of the community. So just a couple of the things that we have worked on together is things like a teaching trail, a nature trail with the school, so that the kids, at least in their classrooms, are once again reintroduced to the plants and animals and the places and the place names that were being lost because kids weren't being out in the woods. There's a big, beautiful wetland right behind the school, big cattail marsh going down to Onondaga Creek, and a lot of the trails had all grown over. So we worked together to make a boardwalk going down to the creek, so the kids and the whole families are once again accessing the creek in ways that they hadn't before. And Audrey Shenandoah and others helped to create educational materials that could then be used as sort of a nature trail along the wetlands. At the health clinic on the Nation, put in a native plants garden to remind people about the other healing options that are there as well. The kids from the Nation come up to the university once a year for Environmental Career Day. That is so much fun. I love their questions. And then with the young people, again, to try to encourage the young people to think about careers in environment and natural resources. We have summer internships for the Native students on their own territories, doing vegetation mapping of their places and then coupling it with oral history, that when we come to a particular place, the students, part of their charge is to also go to talk to their family members to say, well, why is this big stand of tulip poplar here and no place else? And then you find out, well, that's where so-and-so used to have this great big cornfield. And so the oral history coupled with the biodiversity has been pretty fun. Let me go through some of these. Just to say that I think, again, at my institution, because we have relatively few Native students at our institution, but we train a lot of natural resource managers, it seems important that we bring this message to the natural resource managers so that as these mainstream scientists go out, they have some sense of traditional knowledge. And so we do ethnobotany. Okay, so bottom line, if we think that traditional knowledge is important to our science and important to the land, we have to support the communities that have generated and held on to that knowledge. Something we all know, but again, many of my colleagues are resistant to hear that. So I want to just talk a little bit now about some of the research work that we're doing in this regard, primarily with restoration of culturally significant plants, because one of the other things that we heard from our collaborators at the Nation is, well, what are the restoration priorities there? And they did identify plants of particular importance, notably sweetgrass. And they would say, well, you know, it used to be that you could wake up in the morning and smell sweetgrass, and I don't even know where to find it anymore. And so when the students did the vegetation inventory on the Nation, there was no sweetgrass to be found, whereas only a generation ago, people said it had been there. So some of the grad students have been working on that. Another student, Jimmy Costello, who some of you know, is working on wild rice, but that's up on the St. Lawrence. So we're looking at sweetgrass, and in this audience, I do not need to say that it's a cultural keystone species. This is just some of the other culturally significant plants. We're working with black ash, that beautiful corn washing basket out there. Put your bids on. Black ash is an important Iroquois basketry plant. So we've done some work in trying to bring back the health of black ash in the communities as well, some medicine work. But why focus on backstreet plants? Again, a lot of this I don't need to tell you. But sweetgrass, in terms of its biology, as you probably know, it's a perennial, it's a rhizomatous grass. And one of the things that's very interesting about the biology of sweetgrass is the seed set is very low, at least where we come from. I'd like to hear whether that's true here or not. But the seeds, there are few seeds produced on the seed heads, and they're very low viability. So you're nodding, is that true here too? Yeah?
Don White studied that.
I'm sorry?
Don White did a master's degree
Yeah.
with Kathy Zadinsky and Anna Sala, and for the species here, it was same species, but populations here, the same problem with seed populations.
Same pattern, okay. Tends to be a habitat generalist, again, at least in my neck of the woods, wet meadows, sandy soils, disturbed places. So it seems like it doesn't have a specialized habitat that it needs, so why is it disappearing? So all of this, okay. So what we were doing is trying to use traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge to try to approach this question of restoration of sweetgrass. And so traditional knowledge was particularly useful in identifying the questions in the first place of people coming to us with information about a population trajectory. A species was missing. They had noticed these population declines, but they could also point us to good restoration sites because of their knowledge of places where it had been before and the kinds of conditions that grew good sweetgrass. And really it was traditional knowledge that created the hypotheses that the students could then test with scientific experimental validation. And so the project had a couple of pieces to it. First of all, we needed to find out what was the population status, not just in the Haudenosaunee territories, but throughout the Northeast. Is there something going on with sweetgrass? What could be the causes of the decline? What does it need to survive? Can you plant it in restoration plantings? There's some plants that are very amenable to that and others that are not. And then also, how does sweetgrass respond to harvest? I'm going to just go through, well, I guess I do have to go back there just to remind you this idea about the rhizomatous grass, that so much of the plant is underground. That's really how it propagates itself. And this becomes important when we think about harvesting and restoration. So I said that already. So what we did is to go to herbariums, to university herbaria, and look at all the collections of sweetgrass that they had and say, where had it been? And from this, we could plot out its original distribution and abundance throughout the Northeast. And you see all those red dots are places where it had been in abundance, at least places we could relocate from the incomplete herbarium data. And then go back to visit those places and see, is it still there? What's the population status at that point? And mostly what we found is that it wasn't there. It had been lost to development in many cases lost to succession. There's more forest in the Northeast today than there was 100 years ago. Agricultural lands being taken back over by forests. So a lot of those early successional places where sweetgrass was thriving are now gone. But also lack of burning. A lot of the sweetgrass fields had been burned by their traditional caretakers, and that was gone. But among the basket makers themselves, they were worried about harvesting practices and were they essentially being over-harvested. One thing I do want to go back and mention is, see all these red dots, the places where sweetgrass still is? These are very near to traditional homelands of Haudenosaunee people. This is the you can't see where I'm pointing, up at the top. Yeah, well, anyway, there's red dots up at the top are Mohawk country, where these fine sweetgrass and black ash basket makers are. You see some down here at Onondaga Nation as well. So it was an interesting correlation that the places where sweetgrass still was thriving were near to where native people were. And I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. Ganajohalege is one of the restoration sites that we chose to work with. Ganajohalege is, we say, a new community on old land. It's old Mohawk tribal land from which they were displaced long ago, but they've recently bought some up to do as what Tom Porter says, we're going to do Carlisle in reverse, right here at Ganajohalege, and reteach a lot of the traditional ways. But there was no sweetgrass there. And sweetgrass being integral to the community, we chose that as a restoration site. I'm just going to go through all this. We did companion plantings, cover crops, basically seeing how could we reintroduce sweetgrass, and found it was pretty successful. The rhizomes were transplantable. One of the questions was, can it be replanted? We found, at least in our habitats, very successfully. Within a year's time, we had quadrupled the cover of sweetgrass in these appropriate planting areas. So, and now there's sweetgrass back at Ganajohalege, and they're teaching basketry and language classes there around it. So then, to finish up, what's the relationship between harvesting and population status? Because the basket makers we had been working with, particularly up at Akwesasne, had said that they were concerned there were too many basket makers on too little sweetgrass. And there was also a debate on harvesting techniques. Some basket makers are saying, you can't do it this way. The others were saying, you can't do it this way. So they asked if we would work on that question. So basically the two ways that I'm just in the interest of time, probably going to dispense with some of this science and just tell you the story. The two ways that that basket makers are taking the sweetgrass were pinching, just by taking single columns of individually selected long shoots, or others were doing the grab method of pulling it up and, in fact, breaking the rhizomes and taking a bunch of sweetgrass, bringing it home and cleaning it there. So really two different disturbance regimes, pinching versus grabbing. And so we're going to evaluate the effects of these harvesting techniques on sweetgrass to ascertain whether, in fact, it was being harvested the wrong way. There were, of course, also the all-important control plots, places where there was no harvesting done, and experimental design, blah, blah, blah. My poor student, I shouldn't say that. It's obviously very important to couple scientific ecological knowledge with rigorous experiments. That was basically our strategy, because let me tell you, when my graduate student proposed this to her committee, sitting around with all these other plant ecologists, I'll quote this to you. One of the other scientists said, "No, this will never make a thesis project, because anybody knows that if you pull grass up by its roots, it's all going to die. Why would this be a project?" And they were saying, well, if this is traditional knowledge, I'm sorry, this doesn't make any sense to me. So this student was very brave in continuing with this work. She was also very patient, because her project involved watching grass grow. We had these restored plots, and basically what Lori did is, so we had these plots. She went in and tagged individual stems of sweetgrass, thousands of them. And then we harvested. We went and we applied treatments. Yes, that's what we did. We harvested, either taking half of the biomass by the single pinch method, or half of the biomass by pulling it, or by leaving it completely alone in the controls. And then she tagged all of the grass blades that were left, and then went back, because you have to do the population demography to look at what are the birth and death rates in the population. She deserves a medal as well as a thesis. But basically, look what we found here. Here's the data for the increase in tiller density, the number of new shoots in these sweetgrass stands. The places where they were grabbed, pulled up by their roots, I'm still doing that, you can't see that. In the middle, pinch the individual stems versus the control. One of the most important things that you see here is, what about the control? Thank you. That's a good idea. Modern technology. All right. Top button. Good. All right. So here, let's just look at the control, which, as you see, is significantly lower than either of the harvested plots. What does this mean? That the sweetgrass that wasn't harvested at all did worse than those that were harvested. And in fact, the more vigorously harvested, the ones that were essentially pulled up by their roots, did better than those that were taken by pinching. And so, first of all, what we see is that human beings being involved in this system their harvesting was the disturbance regime to which those plants are adapted, and that they flourished under harvesting of 50% of the biomass, which again was dictated by our traditional collaborators. Never take more than half. So we used 50% as our harvesting rate. So basically, what we see, to finish up here, why might this be? Well, what we know, again, aside from my colleagues who said, well, anybody knows that if you rip grass up by the roots, it's going to do poorly. In fact, what happens is, in this rhizomatous grass, all the buds are underground. You break the rhizome, the buds release, send up new shoots into the little hole that you've just created there, which is full of light, more nutrients. They were flourishing on this anthropogenic disturbance regime, and it's not unlike the way many grasses respond to herbivory. This is a real famous model by Sam McNaughton, who looked at the relationship between grazers and grasses. That, in fact, as we know, in many grazers, like the buffalo, grass growth is stimulated by herbivory of buffalo. And that's what he showed here. There are some plants that if you add herbivory to them, they decline really quickly. But there are many grasses show what's called compensatory growth. You be an herbivore, either by a basket maker taking them or by chomping on them, and the plants grow more. up to a certain point. And so that, we think, is the explanation for what it is that we saw. So this is consistent with some of the work of other ethnobotanists, as well as with traditional knowledge that suggests that if you harvest respectfully, the plants actually will respond very, very positively. Kat Anderson's work with digging of root plants, you can take up to half of them, and if you do it in the right way, then the population is completely resilient. It isn't disturbed by taking half of the plants at all. Release of black ash. One of my students, Tom Touché, was looking at the black ash as a basketry plant, and people again said it was over-harvested. Well, it turns out that black ash is a gap phase colonist in the forest. It was being under-harvested. In the old days, when there were a lot of black ash basket makers, a community would have to go out and take 5 or 6 trees home at a time. They'd create a big gap, which is just what the black ash needs to regenerate. If you just go and take 1 tree, the gap isn't big enough. Not enough sunlight comes to the ground to really stimulate that release from seedling to sapling. So again, we see an example where human disturbance, human use of the plants is important to their survival. And so then to finish with this common ground of SEK and TEK, if we could take a traditional knowledge explanation for what we see with sweetgrass, with black ash, with probably a lot of other plants as well, we say that if we use a plant respectfully, it will stay with us and flourish. And if we don't show it respect, it will go away. And at least in my tradition, I expect in many of yours, what does respectful use mean? It means using it. It means honoring the gift of that plant. It would be disrespectful not to use it, as opposed to the idea of, well, the best thing we can do for these plants is to leave them alone. What we see in the case of sweetgrass is the worst thing you can do to those plants is to leave them alone. And so how do we then translate this idea of traditional knowledge, which is captured in this very old wisdom about plants? How do we then translate that to our scientific colleagues? Use creates disturbance gaps, which can stimulate compensatory growth, reduce resource competition through reduced density. Different words for the same thing. But the importance, I think, here is that we have to speak each other's languages. That is where finding common ground comes from. To talk to resource managers and plant ecologists, perhaps, and talk to them about the practices of our elders, of our communities relating to plants. They can't hear that as well as if we say we have this experimental verification, which translates that into your way of thinking. And I think that's one of the powerful symbioses that we can look here between TEK and SEK, is learning to speak each other's languages. So I'm sorry I haven't left much time for questions, but maybe a few. Here, thank you. So any questions or comments? We can also talk over lunch, but yeah.
I was just curious.
Let me give you the microphone.
Oh.
Sorry.
About going back to the Onondaga land rights action, which is that a title? Is that like the title of the action itself?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that what they are looking for is title to the land. Can you talk a little bit more about what particularly are you talking about, like fee title? Is the land held in? Do they want it to be held in trust?
Those,
or not?
The actual remedies here are yet to be worked out in the courts, and with Oneidas and Mohawks, they're not yet to that remedy phase. What they're hoping for is acknowledgement that Aboriginal title has never been extinguished, and as it has not in the law. And the Supreme Court has upheld that Aboriginal title to all of these Haudenosaunee lands in New York State has not been extinguished. But the remedy is the catching point. What do you do about that? And so what Onondaga Nation is proposing is that any of the settlement, instead of moving people off their land, which, as we know, no one wants that to happen, is the Onondaga Lake, for example, which is where the peacemaker brought the great law of peace to the Haudenosaunee. That's a place of 9 Superfund sites right now. Yeah, yeah. So those are the remedies they're hoping for, is restoration of the land. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious about your medicinal plants garden. Do they harvest from that and actually use the plants in the clinic?
No, it's a display garden only. Yeah.
Now, eventually, will that be something that's feasible? Or?
Not from that garden in its configuration, but the idea is to again encourage people to remember their traditional medicines, many of which are present on the nation territory, and that's another thing that they're hoping to do, is to do more restoration of medicine work. But I'll also say that at the behest of the community, in the Tribal University Partnership, we're not working on medicines because that is protected knowledge, and they asked that we not do that. Yeah. Yes.
This theme of this conference is tech and like ecology. I would just the theme of this conference is like finding common ground, right, between the two worlds. And I was just wondering why there was not more elders involved in the sharing of this information and knowledge, and what can be shared and what can't be shared. If this particular type of conference is to proceed in the future, I feel that we should have more active role of elders here, because they are like the encyclopedias of our nations.
Absolutely.
Not that academia is not important, or science, but so is the traditional ecological knowledge from our elders.
I agree. Yes, and especially in learning to speak each other's languages, we have to be in the same place to do that. I would just say that some of that is starting to happen within the Ecological Society. That was one of the priorities that we had with creating this traditional knowledge section, is that our sessions, we bring practitioners, not academics, to talk about these things. And just remembering Henry Licker saying, well, this has got to be a piece of history where we're sitting here telling the scientists what to do. I think you're absolutely right. We have to bring everybody together. Ron.
I was interested in the master student's defense of the research plans, because it is interesting where the burden of proof often lies, and the fact that the traditional method had to be proved to be effective. Why can't the testimony of the elders that it's effective get you past that and ask some other question that maybe the elders have that they would like to know? And so bringing the elders into the review committees and getting the questions up to speed, and not having to replicate what's already known. I mean, people don't, I think if you proposed a proposal and you had 6 studies that had already proved that they would say, well, don't do that. And so you need something equivalent on the traditional side. Well, don't do that. We know that. So we want to find this other thing out. And so we're still, I'm afraid, sometimes in this period where we're still, the burden of proof is not fair yet.
And this is something that philosophically, as we try to find this common ground, is, I think, a very knotty problem. That a strategy is to, okay, let's take an experimental verification to show that traditional knowledge is true. Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to cross-validate the knowledge? To me, I don't know what the answer is, but I think of it as the result of the power differential. It's the way it is. It's the way it is for now. But I hope through the work that everybody here is doing, it won't always be that way. I think, Pat had her hand first.
In some of your papers, and then again today, you mentioned this idea of becoming indigenous to a place. And it also makes me think of Eric Higgs's concern that restoration become too much of a profession and doesn't involve the community enough. Could you speak a little bit more to that idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I meant as I quickly went over things like getting your hands dirty and material reciprocity with your place. If you simply hire restoration consultants to come in and recreate a wetland or whatever, does that do anything to restore a relationship to place? I don't think so. I think it has to be investment of people's knowledge and your hands in the dirt to remind you about that material reciprocity. So a lot of the small-scale restoration that's being done is being done at a citizen level. And I think some of the powers that be sometimes brush that off as too small and decentralized to matter. But I think that's where restoration of reciprocity with the land comes from. And you know, we should invest more in that. I think Jill is next. Oh.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with the start of the project, what kind of changes happened within the communities themselves, especially between the interaction between elders and youth? And just as these restorations are going on, what was the community's reaction to it?
Mm-hmm. I can answer that really just anecdotally. It's not anything that we have measured or looked at. In the study where the kids were out mapping their vegetation, and they said that they were able to have conversations with people that they hadn't about the land that they hadn't ever talked about before. So they got a better grasp of history of place associated with of past land use. For example, a lot of the kids didn't know that their own parents used to be involved in burning particular hillsides. They haven't burned in a long time. So those kinds of conversations, I don't know about really systemic change. I know that the whole community uses the boardwalk and so forth. Is there another part of your question that I just forgot?
Yeah, because I was just curious on how that sometimes changes. Like where, because I know in the community I'm from, Chicago, there was a creation of a medicinal prairie garden by accident, and it actually, a lot of elders who normally wouldn't talk about plants or even just growing up gathering certain plants started talking about it, and now the Indian Center there has a wellness and health center where the elders and grade school kids actually manage the garden, that they've sort of expanded this garden and are working together and sort of learning from each other. And that's something that, because there's always a generation, a split between generations, and the plants in a way got people talking, and I think a lot more even just community-wide problems are being solved because people are just, there's a medium where people can talk, and so I was just kind of wondering how the project was, because I mean all communities have their dynamics as it were, so I was wondering how this kind of played into that.
I think the only other spin-off from that in terms of bringing this into the community more broadly, because we have worked primarily with the kids, is the kids did a sweetgrass restoration on their school grounds. And then they were bringing sweetgrass home and talking about it. And then there was a request, could we get some of that? And could we plant it here and here? So it would be this sort of decentralized restoration. And it's happening in, maybe backyard by backyard, not on a big scale. Yes, Rich.
I was really interested to see when you said that people who were harvesting sweetgrass traditionally said, or there was a disagreement between how you should sustainably harvest it. And in a way, they were both right. I mean, both harvesting techniques work better than the control. But I wonder what happened when you, or did that student bring that information back to the harvesters, and how did, if at all, the sort of the empirical verification of the one method, I guess, as being better, in one way anyway, than the other method, did that integrate back into the harvesting method? Or that seems like a really interesting place where maybe the two really did come together, or could have.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The findings of these studies were shared back to the communities, both informally, and they had a basket-making conference about sweetgrass and black ash, and the results were presented there. And there were just a lot of nods of, yep, we knew that. But like you say.
But it does sound like there was a disagreement.
Oh, there had been, right. And how that, whether that disagreement has, how that has played out in people's harvesting techniques, I don't know, other than validation of, yeah, I knew that the way we were doing it was right. I don't know. It would be interesting to follow up.
Any more questions? Okay, if not, we have an hour break for lunch, and then we come back, well, an hour from now, I don't know what time it is, and there will be 2 concurrent sessions, one in here and one in 327, so schedule is posted.